And that sword is the ability that the civil government has to enforce civil order. Not the first table of the law, but civil order. You say, where does the Bible say that there's another kind of sword? Romans 13, verse 1. Speaking about Rome. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Let me ask you, who appointed the civil government? God did. Did Jesus recognize that? He most certainly did. What did he appoint the civil government for? To rule in religious things? No. To rule in what? In civil matters. To preserve the civil order. Verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists the authority, that is the civil government, resists the ordinance of God. And those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. In other words, if you obey the law, no problem. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister. Notice that it even says that the civil power is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he, that is the civil magistrate, does not bear the what? The sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Who has the other sword? The sword of force, the literal sword to preserve the civil order, where you can punish violations of civil law. It's the state that has that sword. So let me ask you, does the church have a sword? Yes. Does the state have a sword? Yes. Where do you have the problem? When the church uses the sword of the state. That's what the Bible calls fornication. By the way, lest you wonder whether the civil power has a right to actually legislate the first table of the law, let's continue reading there in verse 6. For because of this, you also pay taxes. See, because God has placed them there, you pay taxes. For they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render, notice the word render, just the word that Jesus used. Render therefore to all their due. Taxes, to whom taxes are due. Customs, to whom customs. Fear, to whom fear. Honor, to whom honor. Owe no one anything, except to love one another. For he who loves one another has fulfilled the law. Which table of the law is this talking about in the context of the civil government? Love your what? Your neighbor. And then, if you still don't understand it, verse 9, for the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, are those all commandments that have to do with the second table of the law? Absolutely. Are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. The Apostle Paul is saying, look, we should obey the civil law because it's the civil law, but we should also obey the civil law because of love. As Christians, we have two motivations. Number one, because the civil law says it. It's not because we're afraid of the civil law. But the real reason is because when you have the law written on the heart, you're going to love your neighbor.